like to talk about who our presenters are today. First of all, as always, we have Jim Viola, who is the president and CEO of HAI. He's just down the hall from me today. We have Crystal Maguire, who is the executive director of the Aviation Technician Education Council, or ATEC. And we have Dr. Fred Dyen, who is the professor of aviation maintenance, professor of aviation maintenance technology at Blue Ridge Community College here in Virginia. This is we do encourage group participation on these webinars. If you have a question, there is a module on the side of your control panel that will allow you to type in a question. We will answer questions towards the end of the webinar. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. We don't always have enough time to fit them all in. We'll see how things work today. If you miss this, if you miss part of it, if you want to share this with other people, there will be a video link coming. We usually try to get it out the next day. Sometimes it's as late as Monday before we get that posted, but we do try to get all of those to our website. And with that, I would like to introduce Jim Viola, our president and CEO, for his introduction.
Oh, hello, thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. And thanks everyone for joining us again today. One of the points I'd like to make today, or to stress actually, especially to our members, is that HAI is a resource available to our industry for resources. I think each week we end these webinars offering my email address, president@rotor.org, where not only HAI members, but you on here today in the industry can ask HAI questions or provide comments to me and the HAI staff. We like to think that it is working and we're getting some good feedback, and we hope that you agree. I will let you know that a survey by a leading aviation publication at the end of 2020 indicated that its readers felt that HAI was the leading industry resource for the information during the pandemic. And of course, that pandemic is continuing. And so we are reaching out and trying to provide you the most updated information to help you get through this pandemic. And we will continue to improve. And that feedback we get from you will help us improve. We know that industry is changing and there is always more room for continued improvement. Actually, I like to say that HAI is even leaning forward on some of that, and we have some exciting changes coming to provide you and HAI members, in some cases the whole global industry, a different way of communicating. Just one of those examples in this expansion is bringing many of the rotor safety challenges courses from HAI Heli Expo to online. While we're still disappointed, as you are, that we couldn't hold Heli Expo this year, it doesn't mean that we can't provide you with access to that valuable training that we bring together every year. So we have a great staff of subject matter experts to tap into here at HAI, and their knowledge and experience spans a significant portion of the industry, and we rely on them as a resource every day. But there are also those industry leaders more knowledgeable about different subjects. We made it a point to ask those people to share their knowledge during these webinar series. So today's webinar is a great example of industry professionals to join us to break down complex topics. Late last year, the US Congress mandated that the FAA replace the current Part 147 regulation governing aviation maintenance technical programs with new language. So what do these new changes mean for the current and future aviation maintenance professionals? For our answer, let's get started with today's topic and allow the experts to explain what these changes mean for the men and women who keep our aircraft flying. I'd like to invite Crystal Maguire to turn her camera on and join us for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. I'm going to ask Fred maybe to go ahead and pop on too. Fred Dyen is here from Blue Ridge Community College, and he and I work often together. We're going to kind of tag team this presentation today. Fred is a longtime director with ATEC on the board, and he also heads up our regulatory committee. So we'll just do this together today. So Crystal Maguire, executive director of ATEC. If you're not familiar with the trade association, it represents Aviation Technician Education, and our core membership are US-based schools that have a Part 147 certificate. So there are around 180 of those schools in the US. Around 80% of those schools are members of ATEC. So very, very vibrant and active group of educators that are involved in ATEC activities. So Janice will go ahead and switch to the next slide. Today we're going to talk about Part 147. So Jim mentioned, and we'll give you just a little bit of history on how we got here. Our primary objective today is to talk about what's actually in the direct rule. So Fred and I are going to walk you through some of the highlights from the language. But I noticed that Jen and Gina were on today. So there was a great article in Rotorcraft magazine. It must have come out probably November, December, so maybe harken back. But we did a whole feature on Part 147 reform. At that time, we were still sort of in the reform mode, like trying to get language pushed through Congress, still working with the Federal Aviation Administration to get the rulemaking reformed. But that article really kind of goes through a lot of the history, if I remember. So just go back to that. And so today we'll kind of pick up where that article left off, because like I said, at that time, we weren't really sure if we were going to get our legislative efforts actually to the end line. So this slide is just supposed to kind of illustrate how we got here. So Jim mentioned Part 147, the regulation that governs aviation maintenance technical schools in the U.S. has been very outdated for the last 50 years or so. One of the main critiques of the current regulation is that it includes curriculum requirements in it that are very outdated, has very specific and operations requirements in it that really hamstring our schools and their ability to teach the latest technology. So our community with our industry partners have for a long time been working with the FAA to reform the rule. So it goes all the way back. 2003 GAO issued out a report saying, hey, we all agree Part 147 is outdated. FAA, let's get it revised. Since then, we've worked with our leaders in Congress to really put pressure on the agency to make sure that the rulemaking is a priority. After supplemental notice, original notice of proposed rulemaking came out in, I think it was like 2018, it's been a while, and then a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, thank you, came out.
14.
Thank you, Fred. They have a better grasp on the timeline than me. All the days just sort of run into one another. So after the second proposal came out, the community came together and decided that we really didn't like the way the agency was headed. We really thought that our schools needed more freedom in order to meet some of the industry demand that we knew was coming and the shortages that we were facing. So went to Congress and asked them to work with us to talk about getting different language promulgated through the FAA. So that's what we did. We drafted what we wanted Part 147 to look like. And when I say we, it was school, it was academia, it was industry, it was labor. We had a great coalition that came together, hammered out the language over a couple of years, really, because it was also part of our response to the agency supplemental rulemaking. And we got Congress to pick it up. So in December 2019, it was a bipartisan legislation, so introduced in both the House and the Senate by Democrats and Republicans. We spent the next year garnering additional support from co-sponsors. And so what the language does is directs the agency, like I said, to remove current Part 147 and replace it with very specific language that the community drafted. And then lo and behold, that language was rolled into the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2001, which is the public law that passed in December. If you'll remember, the coronavirus stimulus legislation, end-year funding, there was a whole lot of things that were in that Consolidated Act. And kind of in the last few pages, Part 147 made its way through as well. So Dan, if you'll flip to the next slide. So this slide just really illustrates, I mentioned that was a coalition effort. There were a lot of activities that went into getting it through both houses and getting it through committee markup. Obviously, in parallel, we were working with our FAA counterparts through the rulemaking process. But again, just wanted to mention that while it may have seemed abrupt coming in this Consolidated Act, sort of buried in a very large document, we did this correctly, right? We introduced it a long time ago. We've been pushing members of Congress. We've got a lot of input from industry on it. We think it's a good rule, the way to go. That's kind of what Fred and I are going to talk to today, is exactly how it will work. But these first two slides, again, just kind of illustrate how we got to where we are today. Dan, if you'll hit the next slide. Okay, so big picture. So the law I mentioned removes and replaces the current rule. Very specific, right? Take it out and put this language in. We are working under the assumption, the community, we've had several webinars within the Part 147 community, educating our members, letting them know what's going on. We are working under the assumption that the FAA will issue this new language via a final rule by March 27th, because that's what's in the law. We understand, right, that congressional deadlines are often missed by the agency. The agency may or may not decide to do exactly what the law says. But for purposes of, again, us trying to prepare our community for these new opportunities, that's the assumption that we're working under. The new rule is heavily reliant on airman certification standards. So if you're familiar with pilot certification, you'll be familiar with the ACS. There are ACSs out there for various levels of pilot certification. We are currently building a version for mechanic certification. So I'm on a working group, an FAA industry working group that has been working for 3 years now, I think, getting the mechanic ACS built. So the Part 147, while the mechanic ACS is not yet published, there is a draft version that's always available on the ATEC website. We're waiting for the FAA to actually publish the document. The Part 147 direct rule relies heavily on that certification standard. So what it says, the direct rule, is that schools, you're required to align your curriculum with that certification standard. So you, industry, are encouraged to go look at that ACS, because that is the type of skills and knowledge elements that will be taught in A&P schools moving forward. Very similar to the current 147. There's not a whole lot of shift. That's actually what we're trying to educate our members on now. There's not a whole lot of shift from the current 147 now. The ACS is not a rule. It's going to be a living, breathing document that will be continually revised. So once we get everybody shifted to aligning their curriculum with the ACS, then we'll be able to revise curriculum moving forward. But Fred's going to talk about that document in a minute. We'll go into a little bit more detail. But big picture, again, that's what the performance-based direct rule, heavily reliant on that standard. And relying on that standard, keeping up with technology as it advances and differing skill and knowledge requirements as we move forward. The quality of an educational system is going to be based on the student test performance. So we took language directly out of Part 141, so the flight school regulation, that says you're going to assess your quality system of your school is assessed based on your outcomes. So otherwise, the agency isn't going to micromanage how maintenance school is run. So no longer are they going to be, things like mandating seat time or approving curriculum or looking at grading systems, right? If a school is accredited by a federally recognized accreditor, then the FAA will defer to that accreditor on all those types of elements. So very different from the approach today, where there's very specific static requirements in the regulation. Again, this is a performance-based rule. You're going to align with the ACS. I'm going to judge your program by your student outcomes. And if you're accredited, I'm not even going to worry about your quality system, because I know that your accreditor oversees those elements. And then the FAA still retains in the direct rule oversight of things that are specific to an aviation program, like their facilities, like their materials, like their equipment. We still want to make sure that instructors, that if they need to have an A&P, that they have an A&P, that student ratios are in place for things like shop class. So it doesn't completely take all of the oversight from the agency, but there are certain elements in there, right, that the agency retains oversight of. Dan, next slide.
And this is one of the big elements that I see for the new regulation that offers significant opportunities, not just for the aviation maintenance technician schools, but essentially for the entire aviation industry. Now, aviation maintenance technician schools, or AMTS, as we refer to them in the educational world, will be able to develop partnerships with high schools, colleges, Part 145 repair stations, MROs, any group that really wants to take part of the curriculum for training technicians. And they do not have to be certificated individually. They can team with the aviation maintenance technician school, and that curriculum can be offered in a remote location, or not necessarily remote, but different from where the school is at. In the past, we've been somewhat restricted because the FAA has taken a look at the word satellite, which appears in an advisory circular, and restricted any aviation maintenance technician school from offering courses outside of their own individual location. That barrier has now been removed with this new legislation. And so I see this as one of the big pluses with the new Part 147. Next slide. As far as, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I think this one's mine, Fred. So we already talked about, right, the ACS. This is a link. This provides a link. So we said it in the overview, but this is the language that is in the direct rule that says, hey, schools, you have to make sure that you're aligning with the ACS. So I mentioned the pilot world, right? The FAA is the governs the ACS. It controls the ACS. It controls what's on there. Yes, it has industry support and members of the working group that make recommendations, and it also takes recommendations from the public. There's an email at that link right now if you have feedback on the ACS that you can put in now, even if it's in draft form. But there is going to be a very specific way that ACS is revised, and that's the way it's done on the operations side now. So the FAA publishes a what's new document, typically quarterly, that will show the changes made to the certification standard. Changes made to the certification standard will drive both testing, that is the guidance, the 8083 handbooks for the FAA, and the knowledge, oral, and practical tests. And then the certification standard will also drive changes to the training standards, curriculums at AMTS. So now us, the FAA, and who's testing, and the schools who are training are working off the same sheet of music, and we are correlated. So again, very important that we put that directly in the rule. I mentioned that the ACS, so the hang up, right, is the ACS isn't published yet for mechanics. So very important that it get published before, or perhaps at the same time that the new rule, again, assuming the new rule is published as directed by Congress, very important that those two pieces of the puzzle move at the same time. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, this is where AMTSs can really use your assistance, especially in the form of equipment and instructional expertise. One of the new features of the ACS is they have included rotorcraft fundamentals. In the past, most A&P schools have not devoted much more than a few hours, if that, to rotorcraft. It's kind of been set aside. Now they're mandated to cover rotorcraft fundamentals, both in terms of knowledge, risk assessment, and very specific skills. Now, I'd like to see much more detail and more skill development for the rotorcraft, but this is a start, and I'm sure we're going to see more. Part of the problem that we've got to contend with is most of our 180 schools do not have the equipment or the expertise to do a quality job of teaching rotorcraft fundamentals. So I'm hoping, in conjunction with the various elements that are members of HAI, we'll be able to develop partnerships that will allow our schools to have access to equipment, and hopefully much more so than that, to the expertise of potential adjunct or part-time instructors that can come in and really start training the future technicians about rotorcraft. And this is also a very good way for the rotorcraft industry to begin counseling some interest in the rotorcraft industry for these budding technicians. Next slide.
So this is when we talked about at the top about taking the language directly out of Part 141. So this is the performance-based piece. So we, again, copied and pasted what you're going to see, what's in the direct rule in the law. And it will look very familiar if you're familiar with Part 141. So the performance-based piece, school, align your content with the ACS, make sure your students are passing the test. And so that's what this says. You have to have quality that meets a subsection of F1, which is the testing standards. And then also make sure that your students are prepared to take the test. Otherwise, you get to run your program. I'm going to oversee some of the aviation related elements like your materials and facilities and equipment. Otherwise, I'm going to defer to Department of Education if you're an accredited institution, which is by and large, 95% of the schools are accredited. If you're not accredited, I'm going to take a closer look at your quality system, be the FAA. And Fred, I think that's what this next, go ahead, Dan, sorry.
Yeah.
Fred, that's what this, yeah, that's you.
Okay. The legislation is going to move the FAA out of academic issues and leave that to the accrediting body, as Crystal mentioned earlier. As most of you are probably aware, because you've dealt with the FAA on a variety of issues, many of the FAA inspectors have very little education beyond their A&P. And we're talking about the airworthiness, not the operations inspectors. And perhaps some of them have an associate degree, but they have little experience in the qualifications that would allow them to evaluate an educational program. So this is a tremendous asset for the new regulation and for the schools that are out there. One of the other things, they still are going to have a hammer in developing or overseeing the quality control system for those schools that are not accredited, but that's a very small portion of the schools that are out there. Almost all of them are under either a regional accreditation association or a national accreditation association. With that, I think we can move the next slide, Dan.
Go ahead, Fred, you can have that one.
Yeah, what's not in the rule? Curriculum subject area mandates are not specific in the rule. The rule refers to the ACS. Curriculum approval requirements are not there. Seat time, and this is one of the big things, or credit hours are no longer there. In the past, whenever the FAA has come to surveil a school, they've been concerned about the seat time rather than the quality of the graduate. They haven't cared whether or not the students learn anything, just whether or not their bottom has been pasted in a seat and whether or not the school can verify that. So the new regulation is competency based. And this is going to really open things up. Just to give you an example, over the years, I've trained or retrained a number of automotive mechanics. In the past, they've had to sit through, say, a class in reciprocating engines. With this new regulation, that particular individual who may have rebuilt hundreds of engines can come in And instead of spending 100 or 200 hours going through a particular class, he might be able to demonstrate competency in a week or two. And that individual can demonstrate the competencies in terms of skill, in knowledge, and risk management, and receive credit for that particular course and be able to move on. And I see this as a real benefit, especially for those that are coming to aviation with a reasonable background in technician or technology and maintenance. Next slide, Dan.
So when does the new rule go into effect? This is the number one question that we get from our schools. So the direct rule says, FAA, you need to remove and replace with this language by March 27th. So again, that's the assumption that we're working under, but if the FAA does not promulgate a final rule by March 27th, it does not mean that we can start working under the language in the law. So we're making sure that our community is educated, and our legislative team is watching very closely the actions of the agency, and are keeping our congressional champions apprised. And if, you know, the March 27 date comes and goes, then we'll certainly be reaching out to those champions to see what we can do to help move it along. So, and on the implementation side, when the final rule is promulgated, assuming again that it's the language in the direct rule, the direct rule did not put forth an implementation date. The agency might decide to do that. It's our position that the law is written. If you read through it, if you're school and you read through it, there isn't anything in there that you wouldn't already comply with, given that all of those operations requirements are removed. You should be largely in compliance with the new rule if you're in compliance with the current rule. The one thing that we are asking our schools to do is to make sure that their curriculum is aligned with the ACS, since that is something that they'll need to be in compliance with when the new rule comes out. And Dan, if you'll go to the next slide, I think that's what Fred will talk about next.
Right. And essentially what all of the schools are currently doing, or they should be doing, is to develop a gap analysis spreadsheet. So they're supposed to take a look at their current curriculum and how they're teaching and compare that to the ACS to see if there's any gaps. If there are gaps, and there are certainly some significant gaps for just about any aviation maintenance technician school, they should begin closing those gaps under the current rule so that when the new rule goes into effect, they're up and ready to go. One of the big areas is risk management. In the past, we've been teaching human factors mostly just as an individual subject area, usually tied to federal aviation regulations. If you take a very close look at the ACS, they have put essentially human factors all the way through every single subject area, which is where it really belongs. And so it's not a small matter, but it is significant that each school is going to have to take a look at all the risk mitigation factors for each individual subject area and make sure that they are specifically covered, not just in one overreaching class, but in each course that is taught. I think we can move on to the next slide. So how does the rule allow for competency-based programs? This is going to be up to each aviation maintenance technician school, but the way I see this, I've always believed in competency-based education, and that's the way I've set the entire program up here at Blue Ridge. And I think most of the other educators have felt the same way. They just haven't had the flexibility. So now that we take away seat time and credits, if somebody comes to me and I have a list of competencies that the individual must demonstrate, so they have to have a certain knowledge that can be demonstrated through oral and written tests. They have to have a certain skill level, and that can be demonstrated through a variety of projects or actual hands-on tasks. And then they have to be aware of the risk management. Once those are demonstrated, that individual can receive credit. So it's not unlike perhaps an English professor that would say, okay, to get credit for this class, you must write 2 term papers and a research paper and pass a midterm and a final. Once you've done that, whether you come to class or not, if you're successful, you get the credit. We can do the same thing in aviation maintenance for the first time in forever. And to just give a little background, Crystal was mentioning that the current rule is somewhat outdated. If you look at the history of the rule, it was developed to teach technicians to maintain a DC-6. And there's very few of those left flying. Used to be most of those that were flying were either in South America or Alaska. And both of the companies that used to operate DC-6s have switched over to DC-8s. So they're pretty much a dinosaur in the world today. I think we can move on to the next slide. For information and resources, you can visit atech-amt.org/the-new-part-147. You can also take a look at the public law that actually details what the regulation is, and probably the easiest place to find that is at atech-amt.org.
So we also mentioned, Fred mentioned the gap analysis. We worked with our friends at the FAA and got those ACS codes into a spreadsheet that we're asking all of our schools to check against their curriculum. So there are resources on that landing page, previous webinars, that gap analysis, the language of the law, comparison between the current and the future rule, and that's the landing page that we'll use moving forward. I think for this community, assuming there's not a lot of maybe school reps out there, but certainly department directors of maintenance and others that are looking at this from a workforce development standpoint. Fred talked about the ACS codes that deal specifically with rotorcraft. That is a working document, like we said. Feedback on those knowledge, skill, and risk mitigation elements, not just in rotorcraft fundamentals, but throughout the ACS, is welcome and encouraged. So you can give your feedback directly to the FAA or to ATEC, and that's going to be ongoing. So it's a living, breathing document. When it's published, we expect, just like it does on the operations side, that it would be revised and pushed out on a 2-year cycle. So schools would need to be continually looking at that ACS and changing their curriculums incrementally until we get right where we need to be, which may take a little while. And then a couple other things that you might just want to think about from a workforce development standpoint is the opportunities that are available. Fred mentioned for the additional fixed location. So what that will mean for schools is that, so just like we built that, we modeled that off of repair stations, 145 repair stations. So a school can offer their content, at any other additional fixed location, as long as that additional fixed location is under the purview of their quality system. So that's something that we haven't had. I know it seems like a very common sense approach, right? It's done in the flight world, it's done repair and airlines. Schools really haven't been able to do it. There are ways to do dual enrollment programs that, you're assessing credit, or you're bringing schools to your location. But this will really open the door for Fred to be able to provide general content at a high school and get those pipeline programs built to come into the tech school. So we see that as an incredibly powerful opportunity. So if you're involved with a local AMP program, make sure that they are staying on top of this stuff and understanding what they'll be able to do, even though we don't know for sure, right, what the final rule will say. We hope we know, and we're making an assumption that we know. That way we're all prepared to hit the ground running when that final rule does come out. Dan, I think that's it.
Okay, Crystal, Fred, do appreciate that. was incredibly informative. I do have to think, you know, as I was thinking about it as you were talking, it seems like there's an awful lot of opportunities here. There are so many schools. Maybe I'm not sure which one, Fred or Crystal, this one's a good question for, but how can a Part 145 repair station team up with a school to tackle some of these changes?
Basically, it'd just be a matter of the 145 taking a look. If they go to the ATEC website, they can find a list of all the schools throughout the entire United States. And with the advent of computers and distance, as we're doing right here, they would not have to necessarily find the closest school, but they could certainly find a school that might have some interest. I'd like to put in a small plug. I currently have a distance program. I've got students in Antarctica, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Alaska, as well as spread throughout the entire United States. And many, many years ago, I had an interchange with a school in Canada where those students could finish their training in Canada and then come to another aviation maintenance school and take a couple of courses and qualify to become an A&P. So, you know, there's some international synergy that this will allow.
Yeah,
Okay,
and I'll
that's
just add on that all of these schools, the US-based schools, are by and large required to have an advisory committee, an industry advisory committee. So if you've got a local school, which most of you probably do, and you may already be on the advisory committee, I mean, that's a great way to help influence the curriculum. So if in the past you've been on an advisory committee and the response from the school was, well, we can't change the curriculum because it's mandated by the FAA, right? Which is the response 90%. I mean, there's some flexibility within the rule, obviously, but now it really opens up. You can have a rotorcraft specific, you know, specialty school if you wanted to under the new rule. And Fred mentioned distance learning, which we didn't talk about, but under the current rule, you know, schools are getting approval from the FAA to deliver their content online. So you can imagine, you know, the drama that ensued when COVID hit, and you've got all these tech schools who couldn't get their programs up and running without FAA approval online. So this, the new rule also says, hey, school, as long as you're aligning with the ACS, we don't care how you deliver it. You've got an accreditor that oversees the delivery of your content. You aren't going to need FAA approval to deliver it online. So again, that really opens the door for other schools to do things like what Fred has done, which is taken him. I mean, Fred, we don't even talk about how long it took you to get approval to get that stuff online. I mean, it's like a decade. So.
Yeah.
apparently at least since DC-6s were flying. So
The other thing that schools can do that they now have flexibility is a student would not necessarily have to come to the school to demonstrate competency. They could do that at a repair station or an MRO or in conjunction with an IA or a director of maintenance or even just another A&P mechanic. So the flexibility is there in the new rule. And it's just up to the school and the industry to expand it and make it work for them.
I'm going to back you up just a second. You, I think, answered one of the questions we had from Stan Mowry. Where can I find a list of the 180 schools that are available?
Yeah, so go to ATEC under About. There's a school map button. And so we've got it overlaid on a map. And it has most of the schools with aviation technical programs. So it's not just A&P schools, right? I mean, we've got all kinds of aviation themed programs out there. So you can filter by A&P school, but yeah, they're all on that map. And it also includes information about programs, graduate numbers, primary contacts, all kinds of stuff.
That sounds pretty comprehensive. Now to kind of go along that same line of thinking we were talking about just a minute ago, I know, Crystal, you mentioned workforce development. You And we were just talking about how schools could benefit from, or MRO facilities could benefit from working with you. What about helicopter operators? How could they help like develop a pipeline with some of these schools for A&P mechanics?
Well, we haven't really talked about like apprenticeship programs, right? All those types of things, and maybe Fred can talk a little bit more about that. But credit for experience you could always get at Wood 147 school. But I think the opportunity to develop those types of programs really bust open, and we haven't even really thought of everything that you could do. So I tell the schools this, like, you can't really hide behind the regulation anymore, right? Assuming, again, I know I've said it 10 times, but assuming the final rule, we keep calling it the new rule. It's not the new rule, it's in a law. We've told the agency, right, to promulgate it. If that language is actually promulgated, then you can't hide behind the regulation anymore, right? I mean, you have the opportunity to get innovative, but you also have the obligation, right? And your industry partners might be coming up to you about these sorts of things that, I don't know, Fred, you have any thoughts about how you could create apprenticeship programs, under a model under the new rule, what we're calling the new rule?
Yeah. No, I've thought about this quite a bit, and I see that, boy, the opportunities are just about endless out there. And to me, I kind of look at the Ford asset model or Chevy or Toyota, where they go into a college and a student spends 8 weeks in lecture, and then they spend 8 weeks at, say, a Ford dealership actually working on, say, automatic transmissions. And they go back and forth for a 2-year period. And the end of the 2-year period, they qualify for an associate degree, as well as the company that they've been working for has had a chance to look at them for the past 2 years. In most cases, they've got a job, with that agency. And I don't see why we couldn't do the same thing with an MRO or a helicopter Part 145, 135 operation as well.
You had mentioned that there's now curriculum, it looks like, for helicopters specifically. How can we get more curriculum for helicopters into an AMT school?
I would say, twofold. One, address the FAA, the ACS, and say, look, this is a good start, but it's not enough. Technicians need to know much more than just the very basics in rotorcraft familiarization as written in the ACS. The other way is for any of your companies to team with a school and say, we'd like to cover more, and we'll provide some equipment, we'll provide helicopters for a short period of time, we'll even bring in an instructor. And I think most schools would be glad for that kind of partnership.
That certainly seems reasonable. I've got a question from one of our past attendees, Gabriel Amato. Welcome back. Would it be possible to complete AMT ground school online, submit to an ACS exam with the FAA, and afterward complete the practical requirements at an AMT school facilities?
Sure. Yeah, there's no reason. Let me give you an example. I've got a student right now in North Carolina, and he happens to be a pilot, so we won't hold that against him because I'm also a pilot. But essentially what this individual is doing is he's taking the lecture material that we offer each semester via distance. And then since he's a pilot, he has some flexibility, and he's actually coming to our facility for a couple weeks at a time to go through all the projects in the lab courses. And so he will finish his A&P in probably approximately a year, and he'll only be here part of the time to do the labs. Everything else he's doing at home, via computer. Or since he's a pilot, when he's off, in a hotel room waiting for weather or whatever.
And there are other schools, right, that have I mean, Fred is on the edge of, innovation, there are a couple other schools that have it. The problem is now the reason it's limited is because you've got to get approval to put your content online. So as of before COVID, there was only maybe 8 schools in the country that had online programs. Now there's more. Most of them are probably have temporary authorization, but let's just say that I think it's limited now, right? The number of programs that offer something like Fred does, but that they should be expanding, I would think, pretty significantly if the regulatory requirements are, more flexible.
Gabriel also has a follow-up question. Is it possible to get an AMT, A&P certification focused solely on helicopters?
Yes, in fact, one of our colleagues, Britt, runs a helicopter-centric aviation maintenance school out in Utah. As far as I know, he's the only rotorcraft-centric aviation maintenance school, but he certainly has one out there.
Yep, Southern Utah University. And again, I mean, you have a lot of programs that might have a little bit of rotorcraft. I think they have a flight school, and so it's pretty easy for him to make it pretty rotorcraft centric. But yeah, it's a great program.
Yes, indeed. We're very familiar with Southern Utah University's program. We have a rotorship partner program with them as well, and they've done a great job of incorporating not only the flight schools and the maintenance schools, but working with high schools and lower schools to build a pipeline to get students interested very early in an aviation career. Richard Gallagher, welcome back as well. He's asking if we could send out the contacts. Richard, we will make sure that the links that both Fred and Crystal provided are provided in one way or another on our website, probably early next week. I don't know, it'll be the presentation or something similar to it. The video always does have the links if you need them sooner, and we should be able to try and get that up fairly soon. We have a question from Forrest Nault. How does this affect the DME side? Do students still have a final exam, if you will? He's got quotes in there with a DME.
Yes, they do. Students will have to complete the same exam that they currently do. Right now, they have to complete 3 written exams. One of the things that is written into the regulation is students will now be able to take their general exam once they have finished their general subject areas. Now, that's something that has required an exemption, which many schools have, but not all schools. But with the new regulation, it'll no longer require an exemption. And then as far as the oral and practical, there are 5 areas that are tested for the oral and 5 areas that are tested for the practical. And that will have to be done with a designated mechanic examiner. Although in the near future, we're hoping that that will be expanded through the I think it's DAR program.
Okay, we have a question from Craig Palmer. Has there been any thought on continuing education requirements to keep AMTs up to speed on new tech? That was actually something I thought about while you both were discussing the changes. I know that aviation's evolving right now. We are looking at moving into advanced air mobility. And what thought is given into keeping up with these new technologies?
Well, as far as continuing education, that's going to be driven through 65, right? Part 65. And you do have continuing education requirements for the inspection authorization. There's not currently continuing education requirements for a mechanic certificate, not to say, right, that you shouldn't be doing that. But Fred, I mean, you guys have other programs there, right?
Right, but as you mentioned, it is not something that I believe the agency is considering, although they have in the past. Many years ago, some of the old timers may remember there was a push afoot to come up with Part 66, and that was going to include a requirement for recurrent training for all technicians. But that was shelved many, many years ago. So at the present time, the only requirement is for inspectors.
And that's for an individual, right? I mean, your 145s and your 121s are all going to have training programs. But if you're working on your own, just under your certificate, no recurrent training requirements right now.
Correct.
But look for your school, man. I mean, a lot of schools will let you audit their class, or so if you're interested in something, right? It's not about having to sign up for an entire A&P program, especially now that they're going online.
Okay, sounds good. We've got a couple of comments that came in and wanted to share those. People that didn't necessarily have questions, but wanted to contribute. Richard Gallagher observed it takes 3 weeks to become a pilot, and it can take up to 3 years to become an A&P. So there's certainly a time commitment involved there.
I will point out that there are 6 of the 180 schools that offer the A&P in 1 calendar year.
That's an ambitious timeline.
Yeah, you don't have a life outside of A&P school.
But it gets you there quicker.
What I tell my students is it's 1 calendar year. We give Christmas off for good behavior.
Well, you know, right now we are still looking at a shortage of A&P mechanics throughout the industry, not only in rotorcraft but in fixed wing. And so this is an ideal time to somebody who doesn't necessarily want to go to college. They want to, you know, as such, the traditional college path, that they want to try and get out into the workforce as soon as possible. And it seems like that would be an exciting alternative for them.
Yeah, sure.
Keith Levin has observed, I'm super happy to see advancements in the rotorcraft education. The more the better. As someone who switched from airplanes to helicopters, I would have appreciated more material on rotorcraft at the time. Appreciate that, Keith. We are running a little bit close on time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up with one final question. Crystal and Fred, if you could both answer this. What's the single most important thing that you would like our viewers to take away from the webinar today?
I think you prepped us for this, Dan, didn't you? And I didn't even think about it.
I would say, you know, from my perspective, the one thing I would like to see is for the entire aviation community to come together and let's do what we can to make things easier for individuals to become technicians and better technicians.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say it just kind of illustrates the power of a trade association, right? I mean, somebody had an interview with a reporter and they asked, well, is this a model, right, for getting regulation done in the future? No, like we shouldn't be regulating by direct rule, right? There's an Administrative Procedures Act and there's processes that the agency should be taking notice and comment and all of those things. In this instance, we've just been waiting for so long and we're not happy with the proposals that were coming out. And industry came together. I mean, I didn't show the slide with all the organizations, I mean, across the board representing all sectors of aviation that came together on this one issue because it impacts workforce development so much. And look what we were able to do, right? I mean, we passed a law. And we're not a lobbying organization, right? It was a pure grassroots effort. And so it's very cool. So I think it could be a model for that, right? The power of a trade association, being able to get that sort of thing done and really impact the pipeline, because we think it is going to have a huge impact.
Okay, Crystal, Fred, we do appreciate the fact that you gave us your time today. You shared your time, you shared your knowledge and experience. It seems like this is a really exciting time. Crystal, the work that ATEC did, Fred did, the industry did, the schools did to get this updated, I think is going to be a really dynamic change for our industry. We are grateful that you took the time today to explain it to us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
I am going to go ahead and wrap up with a little bit of housekeeping information here at the very end, as we always do. We have wanted to start making sure that you knew that there were additional resources available, just sometimes news information. We suggest you subscribe to Rotor Magazine. It is the official publication from HAI. We publish 4 times a year, and it's free to U.S. addresses, and there's a nominal charge for international mailing. Just go to rotor.org/subscribe. One of the things we'll also be doing fairly soon is trying to include an element where you can subscribe to Rotor Daily as well. Coming up next, save the date, February 11th, next week. We do have one on safe winter flight operations here in the United States. There are places that fly winter ops quite a lot, but we've gotten into some cold weather recently, and it reached into areas that don't normally see as cold weather as what we've been getting. And so we thought, let's talk about that. We're hoping to have a speaker from the California Highway Patrol as well, who was in the news last week for conducting some winter rescues high in the Sierra Nevadas last week. And so we're hoping to get their perspective. February 18th, this is an important one, Mil to Civ Transition Workshop. We know that people from the military are always looking to see what their next step might be. At some point, if that does include transition to the civilian world, we are here to help. We've offered these courses at HAI Heli Expo in the past. They're always well attended. This particular one is at 1700 next week, 5 p.m. Eastern time. That's a little bit unusual, but we want to make sure that the speakers, the presenters who are coming to talk to you can join us. So we do ask that you indulge us a little bit on that one next week for the different time slot. As Jim mentioned earlier, we always do request your feedback. Please contact the president at rotor.org with your questions, your concerns, your thoughts, your challenges, anything that HAI can do to help improve the rotorcraft industry, whether that's going back into some of the older aircraft or coming into the advanced air mobility phase of the industry. We are here to work with all of it. Please let us know what we can do to help. And finally, the webinar is over. Thank you for attending. There will be a follow-up survey coming to you fairly soon. We do ask that you take a few minutes to let us know what you think and what future webinars you'd like us to bring to you. Thank you for your time.